If I'm taking a new topic, I understand that almost everything that I deal with is an essentially contested concept. Nothing is fixed and stable in the social science and humanities. I'm not teaching, elements of the periodic table where I can say this is a fact. It gets them to think in a more critical way. So even something that they think that they understand so fundamentally and often participate in, they'll be very different.
Break down a definition in a way and how to make sure that they understand it and that, as you say, it can be interpreted in various ways. Do you have some techniques of not just reading it, but actually making sure that, okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the academic room where inspiring educators share best practices. And today we have an absolutely inspiring person here, Aidan McGarry, Professor of International Politics at Loughborough University. Thank you so much, Aidan, for coming to the show. Hello.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here.
Yes, actually, the first time I met you was in writing because I bought your book, Political Voice, the latest one, actually, which was published this year. And I will add the link along with your bio in the description for everyone to see. And when I started to read it, it was so engaging on such a difficult topic, which seems to be very complex, that I thought that it would be amazing to invite you. Today, we'll talk about teaching and not writing, though. So my first question is that when you have to introduce a new topic on politics, obviously, to probably new students, how do you prepare for that? What is the combination of theory and examples? So can you share with us some techniques that you use?
Yeah, so I teach in international politics. My background is international politics, but I'm really more of a political sociologist, and I'm quite interdisciplinary. So when I teach, I also kind of approach this kind of mindset as well. So if I'm taking a new topic, I understand that almost everything that I deal with is an essentially contested concept. Nothing is fixed and stable in the social science and humanities. I'm not teaching, elements of the periodic table where I can say this is a fact. I'm talking about democracy and participation and representation and agency. And so I'll often start with the academic literature. I'll start with the definitions. And what I'll do is show that, even something like democracy, I'll go around the room and ask, well, what is democracy? Because everybody thinks that they know exactly what it is, but what they find is that everybody has very different interpretations of something so fundamental to how we exist. And then I'll look at the literature, and we'll go through the literature in terms of kind of identifying how we define concept like this, and then I'll pull through specific examples where it will corroborate some of the hunches that students might have. But I'm always looking to show how things are maybe not quite as they seem. So it makes it a bit more interesting for the student, but also gets them to think in a more critical way. So even something that they think that they understand so fundamentally and often participate in, there'll be very different kind of variations of that, interpretations of that. So a bit of theory at the start to give that foundation and that grounding, and then bringing in real world examples. And because I teach in a lot on protests and social movements and international politics, there's a lot around me that I can draw upon. There's lots of examples from around the world. And I tend to, because I teach postgraduate students, only master's students, they're very international as well. So I have about 90% international students. So I make sure that I have a bit more of a global understanding and focus, because it allows students to kind of really think about how something like democracy is manifest around the world.
Oh, this is wonderful. Thank you. Critical thinking is a very important thing, and not just in politics, but for anybody and for any job you'd like to take. So that's so important. Can we just go back a bit to the definition, sharing definitions, because this could go away 5 lines of very dense, definition from someone, a research paper, very academic language, and this just go on and on and on. Break down a definition in a way and how to make sure that they understand it and that, as you say, it can be interpreted in various ways. Do you have some techniques of not just reading it, but actually making sure that, okay, what does it mean really?
Yeah. So very often, because there are lots of different definitions out there, So for example, I teach a lot on social movements, and I will draw out maybe a few different definitions of social movements from kind of leading scholars, and then when I will kind of break it down. So to kind of think, well, what are the core elements that are common across these different definitions? How do they differ? Why is that significant? And get the students to really reflect upon that. It's to show that the literature is a resource, but they can use it to kind of make their own mind up about how things are. I don't tend to go with these kind of dense, heavy text. I think that academics who write clearly are really in command of the research, and they if you're able to express a complex idea in a clear way, then you really know your stuff. And that's a lesson that I also kind of say to my students as well. Don't try and, when they're doing their assessments and writing things up, or even communicating in class, just to think clearly about what they want to say. And actually, that is usually the best way. They don't have to use a lot of complex jargon. And actually, it's better that they don't.
Yeah, I agree with that, but it's always hard to find a balance in academic writing to be academic and at the same time be really clear, right?
Yeah.
Is there a way where you can really check if they understood it? So do you ask them to reflect? How do you ask them? What is the kind of reflection you expect from them?
Yeah, so I do. Typically, I would have a lecture and then a seminar. Usually, it's a 3 hour block, and the lecture is usually relatively kind of one-way traffic. Although I do tell my students that they can interrupt me at any time for points of clarification. I say that at the start of every lecture that I have, and that sometimes happens and sometimes it doesn't. So they might come in at that point. I'll also be asking them, do they understand? But I also find that students will just be quite will just say yes that they do, and then when you maybe do the seminar discussion, so then I'll break them into maybe pairs or smaller groups and get them to go into a bit more detail, and then I'll go around those groups to make sure, because then I think in smaller groups they have a bit more confidence to speak up and say, oh, what does this mean? Or they might ask me a question as I come around the class that they wouldn't ask at the front of a lecture hall. Even though I say, of course, that
Yeah.
they can, that does change as the weeks progress, as they get a bit more comfortable with the topic and also with me and their fellow classmates as well. But I think you have to be careful with how you ask that question back, because we've also been in classrooms ourselves, and we've had those teachers who are like, do you understand, do you understand, do you understand? And sometimes you want, I think less is more. It's really kind of asking if they understand the really important things, not every 5 minutes, do you understand? I think because I think students can probably sense that you're really asking them if you ask them less, but in a more kind of focused and particular kind of strategic way.
Yeah, that's a good message. Yeah, but also students sometimes don't ask. They feel like, okay, it's a stupid question. So yes,
Yeah.
we have to make sure that they feel, safe. In terms of the activities, you said that you break them down to pairs. What kind of activities do they do in this topic that kind of is more practical?
So we'll do a range of, you know, I will try and make the classroom as dynamic as possible. Because I'm also teaching, social movements and protest and democracy. It's a very lively topic. Students have a lot of um, opinions on it. There's lots of real world examples. It's always in the news. So I think it's incumbent on me to make sure that the classroom is a very lively and interactive opportunity for students to learn, and bringing kind of lots of kind of real world examples. So some of the activities I might do is I might kind of set particular questions. Sometimes I might ask them to set questions for the class. So after the lecture, we might reflect and say, okay, what did you find about this, or how did you understand that? And then I'll get them in maybe 5 minutes in small groups to come up with one question that they think that, as a group, each of us could do. And that's always quite interesting, because then you don't know where it's going. They could ask, and we'll go around the class, listen to what each thinks about the best question to ask, and then we'll actually do that. And that gives them some kind of control and autonomy over the class. They feel that they're, maybe a bit more invested. Sometimes I want to get something particular out of the class. I want them to really understand a concept or an idea or a case study potentially. So then I'll ask particular questions. It's never around the knowledge or the information, but it's always kind of based in concepts and critical thinking. So I would have to be quite careful with the questions that I'm asking. I have one recent example where I showed them a video, a kind of a short documentary on a particular social movement, and then we critique the social movement and also the video and how, because for a course called Media and Social Movements, and I mean, because they are watching this kind of, it's a 30-minute promotional documentary essentially for a particular social movement which field, and then we ask, well, why did it fail, how did it fail? And because they've just seen it and many of them have never heard of this movement before, it's always the most kind of interesting kind of class, because they just come with lots of ideas. It's a really fun one to teach.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Can we go back? I really love that idea that you ask them to come up with the question. Can you share with us an example, probably from the top of your head, if you remember, because that is something amazing when they decide what question to ask. So what, if you can just share, you can even share with us the actual example. What was
Yeah,
it?
yeah, yes. So it's no problem. So, well, from this course on media and social movements, we start with kind of a very theoretical kind of underpinning of social movements, and then we look at particular examples of an intersection between media and social movements, and we look at the Black Lives Matter and the role of kind of hashtags and different platforms. So rather than kind of sharing, okay, in the lecture, I'll go through the history of Black Lives Matter and I'll talk about the intersection of media and social movements, and then I'll ask them to come up with a question for the class. So I remember, I think one time we had a question which talked about the kind of the dynamic between online and offline activism. Do you also need kind of boots on the ground, the kind of people to turn out en masse as well as online? And it was the question was kind of talking about the merits of both online and offline, and the intersection of the two. And we also, another group came up with a question around justice and how justice can be realized through online activism, which is quite an interesting. So that idea of justice was something that we really debated as a class. Well, what is justice? Where does it come from? How is racial justice or injustice different from, say, climate justice? And so, yeah, it kind of led to a much kind of bigger discussion around a lot of experience. So I'll also, say to the students that it is an open and free space for them to kind of share their ideas, but they have to be respectful of others. When I first started teaching like 20 years ago, I didn't really have any kind of problems or issues with kind of, a lot of the students were kind of coming from a particular political perspective, which I pretty much shared. So it was quite easy. But then I noticed about kind of 10 years ago, these kind of voices would come in, which were a bit more critical of maybe a left-wing orientation, or they were a bit more right-wing, essentially. And that was something that I had to manage individually, to kind of remind myself that actually I need to practice what I preach here. And if other people are sharing their ideas, then they can as well. But it did lead to emotional responses. And so that what I would say is, as long as you can, you can share your ideas, but you also have to be prepared to substantiate your argument. You can't just blurt something out which is controversial and then not expect, a challenge from it. But, so I got them to really think about how they evidence their argument. And this is something that I do throughout my lectures and all, like in all my classes, when they bring an opinion, it's like, okay, well, how do you evidence what you're saying? Because and I link it into their assessments, because I'll be marking their assessments, and that's what I'm looking for. It's like, it's not enough to kind of say something. It's like, well, how do you support what it is you're saying? And if someone can do that, that's fine. But it can be a bit polarizing. And I do have students who will share views about particular national political contexts in lots of different countries as well. And that also can be quite contentious amongst certain students as well. So it's heightened. I've taught, yeah, recent years, we've had the kind of invasion of Iraq, we've had Gaza. So, I mean, there is lots of examples where those will kind of come into the classroom as well. But I also think, it's a real privilege for us to sit around as a group of smart, engaged people and talk about these topics. I love the fact that I can go to work and sit around and debate these and help my own understanding as well. And I try and communicate that to students. I think this is a real opportunity for us to put something out on the table and collectively try and make sense of it in some sort of way.
No, Aidan, you should really do that globally for all the audiences and commenters and everybody, not just students. That I think would be amazing. But has it happened that you had a very heated debate even between students and had to step up as a moderator and just kind of ask them to stop? And yeah, or did you have to step in some ways when it got heated?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's happened quite a few times. The last time, I'll not talk about it. The last time was actually was around Trump, whenever he was about 4 years ago, around the time where he lost the election, and somebody in the class was like, he didn't lose the election; it was stolen. It was this kind of, and I was trying to, drive it to kind of say it was more about, yeah, let's kind of deal in the facts, and for their mind, they were dealing in the facts, and was trying to say, well, this isn't actually substantiated in any way, shape, or form, but it led to lots of other students, in a way, kind of piling on this one student, which then I, had to make sure that it was respectful from both sides, and then I made, I then we ended up having more of a debate about freedom of speech and art, the ability to make arguments, and just because you make an argument, you're fine, your freedom of speech, but you have to be able to support that and also be open to that kind of challenge as well. I've also had students where they, in the process of having those debates, will change their mind, which I thought is a really mature and something that I think a lot of us think that we should do, but a lot of us don't. And I had one student in particular who we were talking about British politics a couple of years ago, and they came from a very left-wing perspective, and they were persuaded of some of the arguments of somebody else. So they had come with a very fixed idea of how something should be. Then they listened to various debates around that, and then they changed their own position. And I think some people might read that as weaknesses and not maybe holding on to a particular position. But I think it's very, that's what we want. That's really that's how deliberation should work, how the public sphere also should work. So I found that very impressive of that student, and I thought it was really, yeah, courageous and also quite, mature students. So they've come from they've all done undergraduate before, so they are a certain standard in terms of their writing and their education. They're also quite not instrumental, but they're very focus on their assignment. They've come to do a master's and they want to do really well. And they've done well in the past and they want to do well in this. So actually, I spend quite a bit of time preparing them for the assessments to make sure that it's fed into, of course, it's there in their kind of module handbooks. In the very first introductory class, I'll sketch out what the assessments are, the date, the percentage, the various questions. I'll kind of go through them just to kind of socialize the assessment as well. And then I'll have particular sessions built into the classes, maybe a half an hour for assessment one and half an hour for assessment two. We typically have 2 assessments per module. So they get a lot of support, or you kind of get these ideas kind of brought to them, and then they'll follow up with me often on a one-on-one basis. And I have office hours, and they contact me on email, so they'll kind of follow up in different ways. But in my experience, the students are very they're kind of focused on the assessment because they really want to do well, and we also have a policy of quite varied assessment. So it's not just essay, 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 essay. It's very.
So what is it? What kind of other assessment?
So we'll have, say, individual presentations. We'll have sometimes group presentations. We'll have essays. We'll have book reports. I also have where they come up with a campaign where they build basically a social movement and media campaign from scratch, on a particular topic. So they have some creativity in there as well. Often they'll have questions that they can respond to. But I like and they like whenever they can kind of put something together. So, for example, I have a class on diplomacy in the digital age, where students have to find their kind of three social media posts from different platforms from a political leader on a particular topic, and then built around a concept that we're looking at. So they almost like assemble it themselves, and then they do an individual presentation for, I think it's 8 minutes long. So they're very worried about it because it's actually the first assessment they do in their master's program. And they need a lot of support because they've never done anything like this before. But and they're not just kind of responding to a question I've asked, they pretty much put it together themselves. But in order to prepare for that, in one of the classes, I will get them each. I'll maybe give them a topic like this year it was the United Nations General Assembly had been on the week before. So I said, so everyone in a class bring one social media post from a political leader that was tweeted or posted during this time that deals with an international element. And then they all came into class. They sent them to me beforehand. I put them on slides, and then we went through. And the purpose of that was to show the kind of the range of, if this was a database or a source that we could draw upon, what three would you use? So they would say, oh, I want to use this one on Gaza, and I want to use this one. And so they were able to kind of understand, the choices that they make in terms of the sources that they draw upon and the evidence then potentially that they would have to do it. So that was, I mean, that's quite an out there example, but they seem to be everything, so we design everything from scratch. We, from the lectures, the seminars, the questions, the assessments, with everything. We do some co-teaching. So I teach some of those modules I do with others as well, but there's some that I, pretty much lead on by myself. I quite like team teaching. I think it's also good for students to kind of have different voices. One thing that we do, which is maybe slightly different to what others might teach. So we have these master's kind of programs, but we teach intensely over 3-week blocks. We call them like kind of sprint modules. So rather than a long thing module of kind of 10 or 12 weeks, which is typical in undergraduate provision, we do 3 weeks intensely, just one module. So they take on a topic and they do, maybe 3 sessions, 3 hours of 3 across, 3 weeks. So they do say 9 of those, and then usually we do like a revision and assessment session, and then the 4th week we do the assessment. So they have these kind of blocks. It means that they can really focus on one,
just on one module. They don't have anything else. Oh, that's interesting. Wow.
Yeah, it's quite an unusual kind of setup. The students really like it, and actually it's one of the kind of unique selling points I think of the courses that we offer in Loughborough. So in Loughborough, London, I should say. I actually had a meeting. I met with a few of our global excellence students. We have a number of scholarships for really brilliant students who get their students their scholarships. And they all kind of, I was asking, well, what do you like about the course? What do you not like? And they all said they love this intense kind of block. And, I think from a pedagogical perspective, I think it can be a bit harder because if we're taking some of these ideas, particularly at master's levels, looking at identity or, nationalism or democracy, sometimes I think you need a bit of like a longer space for that to really digest and to kind of reflect, through the readings. But they like the ability to really focus on one thing and then move on to the next. I wonder if this is a product of the generation of students who've kind of grown up with social media, and so just say, okay, I'm doing this. I'm not kind of looking at lots of things simultaneously.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
No, that's really. And can you see some positive outcomes in terms of the performance or anything else? So it's a good way of doing it.
Yes. It allows them to organize their time and focus on one thing. And so it is a lot of kind of reading. So they have to, they have to do all the reading for all the classes. So it is more intense, but they just do one module. So in a way, they're doing the same amount of work, but they're doing it in a more kind of focused way. And then the assessment comes at the end. And one of my I was initially slightly reticent about it, because as they build throughout the year, we moved to the master's thesis. And my concern was they might forget some of the early modules and or maybe not incorporate those ideas into their master's thesis. But actually, that's not the case. Typically a master's student something will really connect with them, an idea or one lecture or a module, and they'll say, okay, this is the one for me. They'll be able to draw on all those readings as well. So I see a kind of variety kind of coming out through the other end in terms of, so it's not just, okay, we do this at the start of the year and then we forget about it. You can see it kind of coming up in subsequent classes. And we also design the modules to make sure that there's an element of, a journey that they're kind of going through.
That's fascinating. Probably it goes deeper then. It shows that they don't forget. It's a
Yeah.
very good lesson. No, thank you so much for sharing it. And even if we mostly talk about teaching, I'm also very interested in your writing. This book, which is really engaging. So the Political Voice, which is your most recent one. So how do you, what is your methodology for writing a book, which is also for a larger audience, not only for your students or just for researchers? And it's really engaging. It's right from the beginning. It's really draws you in. So do you have some techniques for writing and how did you write this book?
Well, thank you for the question. Then I think this book came about because I realized I wanted to kind of pull together various threads of my research. I've done a lot of work around agency and marginalized groups and social movements. And I thought the thing that really connects all the work that I do is voice and the notion of voice, the articulation of voice. And so I started at the fundamentals. I read everything that you can read on voice, like a good student. So, but not just from political theory, but also from, urban geography, from sociology, from media and communications, from psychology, so I was making sure that I had a very clear conceptualization of it. And then I did my empirical research, one with queer communities in India and also with Roma communities across Europe, which is where a lot of my research has been based. And I mean, writing up is sometimes a challenge because, as I mentioned at the start, I want to be clear. I want to take complex ideas, but I want to write it in a way that people can read it. I want, ordinary people who are not even studying to be able to kind of pretty much follow what I'm saying. And I think it's a real challenge. The first time I did this was for a previous book called Romaphobia that I wrote, and I really wanted to write that in a way that policymakers and the public could also read it and understand. And it took me a long time because I think as academics, we know how to write complex, a lot of jargon in a very prescriptive academic way. So to kind of pull oneself out of the comfort zone to write something which is not kind of easy to understand, the communicated in a way that is clearer, I think. So always trying to kind of look at sentences and paragraphs and think, can that be clear? It can always be clear, by the way. It can always be clear. So it usually starts in a very complex, overly burdened conceptual way, and then I kind of refine it so that it's a bit more kind of palatable. But the message is there, the clarity is there, because really that's what I like whenever I read. So the stuff that I find the most impressive and lucid is that kind of writing too.
No, thank you. You managed to do it very well, and I really loved it. And also the messaging from the book and also from this interview. Thank you so much for sharing so generously so many things. I've learned a lot. And
Oh,
thank
thank
you,
you very much.
everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of the Academic Room. Bye bye.